Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you're all here for the Open Authority session. If not, you're in the wrong place. We are attempting to get the lights turned up a little bit, so bear with us. Welcome. It's been a long conference thus far, and I'm glad you all managed to stick with us. My name is Ed Rodley. I'm the Associate Director of Integrated Media at the Peabody Essex Museum. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of MCN. And I'm very happy that this session is happening and that you all are out here to join us. We have an action-packed session with 4 presenters, so things are going to go kind of fast and furious. In terms of a little housekeeping, I think it would probably be better if we give everybody the opportunity to give their presentation and try to hold most of the Q&A for the end. So if you have like a really burning question you have to ask somebody, we'll take a couple of questions, but if you can, hold it for the end and we'll try to have, it's a small enough group that we could probably have some real actual discussion towards the end. And also if people feel like they want to not sit in the back of the room and want to move up, we do have plenty of space. I understand if you want to hang back. Anyway, I'd like to make just a couple of introductory remarks to try to set a little bit of the broader context for this. We have 4 very interesting speakers with us. We have Lori Phillips from the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. We have Elizabeth Bollwerk. Oh, I forget your affiliation, Elizabeth.
It's brand new. Museum of Culture and Environment.
There we go, from the Museum of Culture and Environment. Porchia Moore from the University of South Carolina, and Jeff Inscho from the Carnegie Museum of Art. All going to be looking at different aspects of open authority. So, without further ado, what we're trying to do in this session is approach really a dilemma, right? So a dilemma in logical terms is not like a problem. You can't solve a dilemma for everything. And the things that we're trying to deal with here are really 3 things: openness, authority, and disruptive technologies, right? And there we are, smack dab in the middle. One of the problems with dilemmas is you can never satisfy everything. So openness and authority kind of conflict with each other. Disruptive technologies conflict with everything. And any possible outcome involves sacrifice. So the question always becomes, who are the winners, who are the losers? What gets saved, what gets tossed? And we're in this fairly interesting place right now, particularly around digital technologies and the way that they are making access available to people in ways that it never was before, and also making it easier to challenge authority in ways that it was not possible to do before. And while there are lots of things that are unique about our current situation, this is by no means new. This has happened throughout history, and how we respond to these things will shape really what we become in the coming century. And one of the things that I find particularly important about this issue is this is sort of a zero-sum game. There is only a finite amount of authority in the world. You can't make everybody have more power, right? It's sort of a zero-sum game. More openness does necessarily involve letting go of some kind of authority, or at least some conception of authority. And you just can't retain all of the control that you used to have in the past, as well as giving out more of it. It's not like printing money. This is by no means, like I said, a new thing. Here's poor old William Tyndall. Getting strangled in preparation for being burned at the stake. What was his crime? It was publishing an unauthorized translation of the Bible into English. And the reason he was able to do that was because there was this thing called a printing press that was brand new and made it cheap and easy to disseminate documents. I'm not trying to make any kind of equivalency between what we're talking about now and the religious ferment in Europe and the Renaissance, but this is the same thing. Openness, authority, new disruptive technology, lots of people get bent out of shape. This tension, you'll find it over and over and over again, right? So it's not a new thing. It's also not a web thing. How many of you are familiar with Project Gutenberg? Right? They provide transcriptions of public domain documents. When did Project Gutenberg launch? Anyone? 1971. Tim Berners-Lee was like 16 years old. Oops. You can't see the picture of the internet, but the internet consisted of 23 nodes. Right? You could draw the entire internet on a single side of a piece of paper. That's how small it was. So when people are talking about, oh, this is so brand new and it's unlike anything that's happened before, you should really step back and say, yeah, okay, there are some things that are different about it now, but this is not a new thing. getting it right is important. A lot of critics of openness, participatory design, experiential design, anything that kind of questions this relationship between openness and authority, they usually posit this sort of beautiful classic model of the old museum. It's big, it's grand, it's probably neoclassical, and it's this sort of timeless, changeless state of a museum that is really, it's false. The museum that they're thinking of is a museum that was created in a historical period in response to a previous historical period. Many of the things, if you think of your classic art museum, your Gilman style, paintings, lots of negative space around them, that was a reaction to the previous incarnation of museums that were salon style things where the paintings are all jammed in together, and so on and so on and so forth. So they set up this sort of false equivalency that it's useful to question. And if we want to continue to remain relevant, then we need to continue to question these assumptions. We don't want to be out of touch with the times, and I think you can posit these reactions against openness in the same way that people reacted against such terribly scandalous things like letting women into museums, impressionism, displaying photographs as if they're art. That's not art. All of these things, providing enrichment services to school children. These are all things that were considered sort of wacky and questionable, and that's not what museums are about. And that's for us to decide, really, right? This is bigger than all of us, too. One of the problems we suffer from is that we are usually forced to be reactive, although we like to think the world revolves around us. These technology trends affect the entire society, and compared to people like the recording industry, motion picture industry, the software industry, newspapers, publishing, secondary education, primary education, and so on and so forth. This is affecting a lot more people than us, so much that we like to think that we are masters of our own destiny. Probably a better metaphor would be a boat on a large sea in the middle of a terrible storm. How are we going to react to what's coming is not entirely in our control, right? You're going to have to just deal with the weather that you get. The reason we're all here probably is because we know that nobody can answer this question for us, right? There's no book out there that will tell us what we need to do in order to solve this dilemma in the best way possible. And that's sort of an opportunity as well, right? No one can tell you what's wrong because we don't know what the right answer is. And unlike other time periods, one of the things that I think is interesting is that there are all kinds of other people who are wrestling with the same thing, who are sort of allies of ours. I'm sure people here have heard of DPLA, Digital Public Library of America, Europeana, these amazing aggregators of open content. You're starting to see now people making secondary publications based on the data aggregated by these aggregators, so things like the Public Domain Review, Creative Commons, Wikimedia, Wikipedia, the Open Knowledge Foundation. There are lots and lots of people out there who have both larger views and outside expertise that you can rely on or you can turn to if you have questions. And I would encourage people to go around and look and see how other people are trying to approach openness. One thing that we tend to forget, I think particularly in this group, is that even in the GLAM sector, which is sort of the ugly wiki acronym for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, museums are pretty far behind the times compared to, say, libraries, who have to, they are all about dissemination and openness. They have been wrestling with these issues as long, if not longer than we have, and they have different ways of approaching things. And getting your head up out of the sand and looking around can provide you with interesting insights. All right, last, and then I will turn it over to Lori. When there is no right answer, the solutions you come up with may not be the right solutions for other people. Your mileage will vary depending on who you are, what you're trying to achieve. And I think the interesting thing at this time period over the next few years will be to see the different ways that people try to reconcile what it means to be open, what it means to be authoritative or versus authoritarian, as Laurie has pointed out before, and how people are going to try to square that weird little equation of openness, authority, and disruptive technologies. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lori Phillips from the Children's Museum of Indianapolis.
Hello, everybody. Lowering, and shorter than Ed. So I'm going to take some time today to define the term open authority, which, as Ed pointed out, really isn't a new idea at all. We're just here to move it forward. I'm also going to take a first stab at establishing a spectrum of open authority and provide some inspiration for the future. And I'll end with a list of elements of an open authority project. So when I first began my master's research, there was a buzz in the air about user-generated content. And on the user side, it was really this excited buzz. But on the museum traditionalist side, it was more of a digging heels in, the museum's authority is final. As part of my research, I became interested in figuring out how can museums best integrate visitor contributions and still maintain our authority. And the start of my answer came in 2011 when Rob Stein described the state of authority, and Ed mentioned this. He described the state of authority in museums, pointing out that museums should remain authoritative and not authoritarian. They should move away from this, omniscient voice and being the final purveyor of truth. And really, the museum should be at the center of a public discussion with our communities. So basically, authority isn't all bad, right? The increase in user-generated content has really made the role of the museum's authority even more important. And that's because there's now so much information out there that someone needs to be sifting through it all and really taking part in the conversation. The open and open authority is influenced by the open source movement, and an important principle in the open source community is given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. That essentially means that the more people you have looking at a problem, the easier it is to solve. And so really, in order to do this, you need to be able to give up some control in order to share your authority. So I define open authority as the coming together of museum expertise and community contributions. Openness is needed for us to remain active players in our insanely collaborative world, and authority is needed to bring expertise to all of that user-generated content. Basically, that means that it's not all or nothing. It's not that the museum is always right. It's not that the crowd is always right. It's that we can make it even better together. So open authority isn't very cut and dry. The reason we're all here is because we're trying to define it. And I think that there's really a spectrum of open authority with many possible engagement models, beginning with a more conservative approach, which probably is a lot of what we're doing today, and then leading into a more progressive approach. And Mia Ridge, now this is going to be my next adventure. Okay, great. Mia Ridge recently pointed out an existing model for categorizing public participation in projects, and I've borrowed it for this spectrum of open authority. I think it works pretty well. So things begin as contributory, where the public contributes data to a project designed by the organization. Next along the spectrum is collaborative. So this is where the public is refining the project, but the project is still led by the organization. And then we move on to co-creative. And this is where the public takes part in all processes and all parties design the project together. So generally, the spectrum is moving from being less transactional to more transactional and interactive, and from less dialogue to increasingly more dialogue. And so I'm going to take a first stab at some examples, noting that all of this is up for interpretation. That's what open authority is all about. So feel free to tell me I'm wrong. So I'd say that contributory projects are often what we consider to be crowdsourcing. Mia clearly defines crowdsourcing as an ask directed toward a shared goal that cannot be done automatically and also has an inherent reward for participation. So generally speaking, this can be voting, tagging, identifying objects, transcribing documents. I know Nancy Proctor's talked a bit about this too, about community sourcing, and I really like this idea of this more nuanced approach to crowdsourcing, which involves making bigger asks of a more loyal and committed community. And I think that community sourcing includes things like memory sharing, community blogging, idea generation and dialogue, and sharing media. So these are kind of bigger commitments to make from your community. And then at the far end of the spectrum is participatory interpretation, or really co-creation. And I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about the Reggio Emilia educational approach as a model for this more extreme version of open authority. So it really comes all down to what does open authority look like? And here in a second, we're going to have some current examples and perspectives of open authority in real life. But I believe that maybe the most perfect, perhaps extreme example of open authority is Reggio Emilia, which I'm going to describe. And as I talk about it, I want you to think about what it would mean for all visitors in the museum, not just with children and not just in classrooms. So Reggio is an approach to early childhood education that's dependent on learning being led by the interest of the child, and it's not dependent on the design of the teaching from the teacher. And this happens through authentic learning experiences through ongoing collaborative projects. Teachers support learning through respectful interactions, and they make connections to prior experiences, and then also create opportunities for community collaboration. So I'm going to talk a bit about three kind of elements of open authority, or Reggio Emilia, and how they apply to open authority. And I'm going to start with a focus on the interests of the child. So in a Reggio classroom, the teacher really closely observes the children's interests, and as a class, they create a project around that interest. So provocations are placed around the classroom, and together they dive deeper into a question such as, what is a robot? And this kind of takes over their life for maybe 2 days or maybe 2 months. It's really interesting to watch. In museums, truly adopting visitor interest-led interpretation requires community involvement in the early stages of exhibit design, and requires the means for insights to be incorporated into the core of the exhibit rather than just as an afterthought, or what did you think of this? Like in a Reggio classroom, the community should really be involved before, during, and after the process. All right, also key to the Reggio approach is the notion of respect and cyclical learning between teacher and student. The child's participation is highly valued because their contributions come from their unique perspectives and their background. The teacher really is learning right alongside the child. So topics are never dumbed down. You're never going to see a cartoony representation of an artwork. You're going to see an actual print of an artwork, and you're going to see all the children discussing it, whether they're 11 years old or 2 years old. And to be honest, I taught 2-year-olds in a Reggio Emilia classroom for a year. I've seen this happen, and it really does work. So it seems crazy, but it works. So this creates a confident community of learners, and all views are respected, and everyone is on equal ground, no matter your age. It's very important. When a curator approaches the interpretation of an exhibit as if they'll be on equal footing with the visitor, it's really analogous to the preschool teacher stooping to the level of a child and not standing over them. And this puts them eye to eye with the student, and you're not speaking to them in a condescending tone. You're speaking to them just like you would an adult. The Reggio approach was built on the premise of community coming together around the needs of children. The respectful dialogue of the Reggio Emilia teacher-student relationship really allows the children to feel empowered, and this then carries through into their own interactions amongst themselves as a peer group. And the physical representation of the Reggio Emilia community is the Atelier, or the studio. So the Atelier extends learning outside of the classroom through this open-ended art space, and that creates free exchange of experiences, materials, and disciplines. And this is very much like the museum envisioned as a forum or bazaar, where community members can share, create, and dialogue equally and freely with the museum. So I feel like the Atelier is a great place for some inspiration if you're looking for community space for your museum. The Portland Children's Museum is one of the best examples of Reggio Emilia applied in the museum setting. The museum includes the Opal School and the Center for Learning, and they're made up of a private preschool and a public charter school from ages 3 to 11. The school is physically within the museum, and it uses art spaces, outdoor spaces, and exhibits in addition to their own classrooms. And they describe their teaching method as a pedagogy of listening and relationships, which I find pretty incredible. This photo is an example of Reggio applied within the museum space. So the students were tasked with creating a new exhibit, and they framed it around the question, what makes a good place to read? And together they decided that a cozy treehouse was the way to go. And so this was the result. The exhibit design was totally led and implemented by the students, and the process is well documented within the space, which is very true to Reggio. Susan McKay is the director of the Museum Center for Learning at the Portland Children's Museum. And when she took me through the museum last year, she said something that really stuck with me. She said, we have to participate as a community together in order to get a full perspective. At Opal School, the children learn this at a young age. We're building empathy from the beginning. I thought this sign perfectly summed up the peaceful, respectful environment of a Reggio classroom. It's an invitation to an event. I actually don't know what event, but it doesn't matter. And they say, we would love if you could come. It's okay if you can't. Love Opal School. If this was an invitation to open authority, I'd probably add, but you probably should come. But all this to say, the Reggio approach is really a spot-on model for museums to increase open dialogue within our communities, where it's if we're already doing this with kids in classrooms, I don't understand why we can't do it with adults in museums, basically. So onward to elements of open authority. Reggio is really just the first, something to aspire to, but really you're probably already doing some open authority projects in your museum or thinking about them, and you just wouldn't have realized that's what you're doing. So I tried to come up with these elements of open authority that you could kind of be more cognizant of as you're planning your process and trying to kind of own that more. So we've already talked about open authority being a combination of institutional expertise and community contributions. So these are the first two basic elements. You then need a platform or a method for your community to engage with you. It could be an existing platform. It could be Facebook, Twitter, Wikipedia, or it could be a platform that you create. You also need content or a topic that motivates your community to participate. If this content is able to be open, that's even better and can increase participation in certain ways. And you can't just provide the means for a participatory project and then walk away. The museum should be a continued part of the conversation, creating a transactional dialogue. What there really needs to be more of is shared control over the project from start to finish. The community really should have a sense of ownership over that project and right alongside the museum. I think that's a big part that's missing often. Trevor Owens has written about the importance of the process, not the product. Early on with crowdsourced projects, it was really all about the end result, X number of letters transcribed. But even more valuable than that is the community and the process behind that product. And so that's something really important to keep in mind. And then there's also needs to be evidence of collaboration. Throughout the project, there really should be some way of illustrating that the community played a key role. Reggio Emilia does this really well because they just inherently document everything they do. But in the end, the museum really needs to take credit. If you don't, then that defeats the purpose of you collaborating with your community. Really be proud of that collaboration. So ultimately, we've already come far in opening up to our audiences, but the possibilities really are endless, I feel. And now we're going to move on to Elizabeth and everyone else with some real-life examples of open authority.
Okay, thank you, Lori. Thank you, Ed. Lori has really nicely laid out the framework and elements of open authority, so my goal this morning is to provide some concrete examples of implementation of this model in museum contexts, and then to try and push the conversation forward a little bit more to think about, start a conversation about evaluation. So to continue a theme that Ed had brought up earlier in the session, my background is maybe different from some of you in the room. I'm an archaeologist. I've been trained as an archaeologist. And so I come at an open authority model from a slightly different perspective. And part of my work as an archaeologist for many years was working with Native American communities. And I worked with a number of other colleagues to kind of try and mend the rift between a number of Native American communities and archaeologists, because for a long time, archaeologists were seen as nicely illustrated in this meme as grave robbers, because a lot of our research dealt with Native American human remains. But that kind of falls into the open authority spectrum, because back in the 80s, archaeologists started giving up authority to Native communities to incorporate them into the process of research and interpretation. And I've been part of that process, and that's where I'm coming from. But as part of that, we've also realized that the general public tends to have a somewhat interesting interpretation of what we do on a daily basis, which ranges from anything to digging up dinosaurs, which I don't do, finding golden idols, which I also don't do. But I do take lots of notes, and sometimes I do go out and drink, which is fun. So in talking with a lot of my colleagues, there's this shared frustration of the public not really understanding what we do. And for many years, archaeologists kind of said, oh, well, we're doing our best. There's not much we can do about this. But more recently, in the 80s and 90s, people have really started stepping up and saying, no, we have to go out and share and engage with the public and tell them what we do, because we can't just wait for them to come to us. And so as part of this, we've been looking, a number of my colleagues and I have been looking out to other areas for models to do this. And we came across Lori's model of open authority and also Nina Simon's work with the Participatory Museum, and got really excited because we realized that is our goal. Our goal is to do something similar with the public that we've done with other ethnic and cultural communities within our discipline, and go out and engage them and give up some of our authority and start incorporating them into the process of research and design. And so 2 colleagues of mine, Robert Conley and Natalie Tate, and I started looking around for projects that were specifically doing this with archaeology, anthropology, and art and history within museum contexts. And we found a slate of 10 projects, which were really exciting, that we co-edited in a volume for museums and social issues. And if you have the ability, I would definitely say take a look at it, because it's about 10 case studies of different open authority implementations that I know I'm biased, but I think are really exciting. And so today my goal is to just talk about 3 of them, because I have kind of a limited time. But these are examples along the open authority spectrum that Lori was talking about of more collaborative and co-creative projects. So without further ado, the first case study is based in Memphis, Tennessee at the C.H. Nash Museum in Chucalissa. And the director there, Robert Conley, came on about 10 years ago and decided to make a really concerted effort to perform outreach with the community in Memphis. And one interesting thing about the Nash Museum is that it's built near a Native American burial ground, and there's been a lot of problematic activity because of that. But as a result of that, it was an institution that was very focused on research, archaeological research and analysis. And as a result of that, completely ignored the community that was right next door, which was an African-American community who's been near the museum opened in 1956. The museum, or the community, has been next door since 1930, so it's been there longer than the museum. But in all of the time the museum's been open, hardly any of that community has gone through its doors, and there was hardly any engagement between the museum and that broader community. So what Dr. Conley wanted to do was make an effort to incorporate that community in the museum, because they're literally right next door, and he felt it was important to include them within this space. And so for many years, he went out, started having conversations with community members, had focus groups, held surveys, held events in the museum space, and invited them directly, specifically, sent individual invitations to community leaders, and had them come in, and he listened to what they wanted and how they felt about the museum and the history of the museum, and eventually ended up creating 2 co-creative projects with the community. The first that's pictured here, so these are 3 members of the community, is a community garden that's housed on the museum grounds. And it's a really large garden where they grow traditional vegetables like corn and okra and squash that are used by the community, and they're also used by the museum. And since that garden has been established, it's also become a part of the museum's interpretive program. And it was created with the insight and input from the community with the guidance of the museum. And then just another quick example, this one includes high schoolers. So the museum actively went out and recruited high schoolers to become interns in the museum, gave them the ability to decide to make an exhibit, but also to decide what topic they wanted to make it about. And so they went out to their elders in the community and talked to them about the history and culture of those neighborhoods and asked them, what do you want to see? What should we talk about? And what came out of that kind of crowdsourcing exercise was that a lot of people were realizing that elder members of the community who had been really important parts of the civil rights movement were starting to get to the age where they were passing away, and they really wanted to capture that information. So those high schoolers then went out, did oral histories and interviews with those elders, came back, created a video and an exhibit, which you can see pictured here. You also see one of the high schoolers doing a tour. And that is a permanent part of the museum, and has been for about 2 years. So this space was designed with the help of museum staff, but the content, the pictures, the overall design was created by the high school students, by the community. So really kind of on the far end of the open authority spectrum. The next case study is a project called Footprints of the Ancestors, which is a collaboration between the University of Arizona and the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. It's also in Arizona. And this program was designed to help Hopi youth connect to their elders, because there was a real concern among the elder generations in the Hopi tribe that the youth were really losing touch with their culture and traditions. And so the University of Arizona and the Northern Arizona Museum decided they would collaborate with the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office to create opportunities for Hopi youth to interact and engage with their elders. And so for about 3 years, these programs consisted of field trips to different parts of Arizona that had spiritual and cultural importance to the Hopi, and bringing both youth members and elders from the tribe to learn about stories of those areas, talk about issues in regards to those areas, and also to just learn topics or practices like basket weaving with traditional materials. And so this is a picture of 2 of the Hopi youth with an elder learning how to do that. So this happened for about 2 or 3 years, and then they decided to do a capstone project, which was both a website and an exhibit that was made by the members of the youth of the tribe who were part of this program. And they essentially gave the members of the Hopi tribe a space within the Northern Arizona Museum to design content about what had really touched them about being part of this program, what had they learned from it. And so this is an example of one of the panels that the youth created as part of this exhibit. And I think it really nicely captures how the content is created by them, because it's about the challenges they are now facing with balancing their traditional values with their modern life, with being modern teenagers. And a lot of them said this exhibit really gave them a chance to express a lot of conflicted feelings that they'd been feeling, that they had been experiencing by having these new interactions with the elders. They're simultaneously excited about learning about their traditions, but it also doesn't always meld well with being a modern teenager. So again, more on the co-creative spectrum, giving them the ability to do content design and make something that's really important to them within the museum space. So the museum providing guidance and some authority, but giving up a lot of that authority. Third one, the collaboration between the City of Philadelphia Mural Arts Museum and the Philadelphia History Museum. This is, pictured here is a large 140-foot outdoor mural. It's entitled, and this is a zoom in of it, Family Interrupted, Community Connected, and it's focused on the struggles and challenges faced by incarcerated individuals and their families and friends. And the mural is created in collaboration with individuals who have been incarcerated and their families and artists that are members of the mural arts community. And you can see within the mural that there are embedded QR codes for people to access to listen to individuals' stories about their challenges and family members' stories about their challenges that came out of community conversations that were held in mural arts space. And the Philadelphia History Museum became involved in this because they have a community gallery that they switch out every couple months, and this mural arts project came into the museum, was part of the museum's space for about 6 months, and also the museum hosted community engagement sessions with this piece of art, but also with individuals and family members of individuals who had been incarcerated. So really trying, again, to get the images and content and art from individuals of the community that are guided by museum practitioners, but the overall creation is really driven by issues that the community wants to talk about and engage with. So more on the co-creative end of the spectrum. I'm actually going to skip this one because I know I'm running short on time. So the fourth one is actually a project that the museum I'm currently at is working on that we've just started within the past couple months. And we're the Museum of Culture and Environment. We're part of Central Washington University, and we've recently made a really concerted effort to reach out to members of the university community that we don't think are well represented or are engaging with the museum. And one of those groups is called ABLE. It's for students with that are differentially abled, so low vision, hearing or problems, who are in wheelchairs or have problems with mobility. And so we brought them into our newest exhibit space, which is not, I apologize, this is not actually a picture of our museum. We did not take a picture of people when we did this, which we now regret, but we're hoping we will in the future so we can actually document this better. But I'm using this picture to illustrate one of the biggest concerns they had with our current exhibit is that there were many, many parts they could not access. So especially our low vision people came in, and came right up to one of the things that we were proudest about, which was this gorgeous graphic. It's about wildfires and dealing with wildfires in Central Washington, and immediately said, I can't see this. I have no idea what this is about. I can't engage with this in any way. And that just made us do a complete 180 on how we had designed the exhibit and what audiences we were trying to reach. And we immediately said, okay, let's sit down and talk about this. So they walked around with us in the tour and toured the exhibit and told us everything they couldn't see, couldn't access, couldn't touch. And We're now currently rethinking the exhibit, and because we're a very small museum, we are implementing those changes immediately into the exhibit, and also because we're a small museum, we can immediately put one of those people on our board, which is really fantastic, because now she's involved and is going to be involved down the road in our decision-making processes in the design and implementation of these exhibits, so we can actually make sure this community is more involved and can engage with what the information we're trying to get out there. So this picture kind of just illustrates the idea of, I know a lot of museum practitioners and myself as an archaeologist really kind of sometimes shudder when we think about people touching objects. But one of the big things we got back from our collaborators is just that we can't experience this if we can't touch anything. You have to put things out there that are tactile for us. And so now we're really trying to think about how we can create those tactile experiences in the gallery for both people who are differently abled, but also people who just want to touch things. As an archaeologist, I've noticed whenever I make presentations, people love to touch things. And so we're trying to bring that into the open authority framework, but we're still very much kind of at the cooperative, collaborative level. So really quickly, just to move, one of the things we tried to do in this volume is think about how to create evaluation frameworks for these projects. And I was really excited to see the facilitation workshop yesterday, because it gave me a lot to think about in terms of how we can create metrics to really start proving the value of these projects. And so because these programs were done over 10 years and a really wide spectrum of the United States, we could only do a very general framework within the volume to kind of think about what to do. And so I used the critical assessment framework, which was created by Douglas Waltz in 2006 and a number of collaborators. And that tends to focus on 3 levels. And the main goal of that framework is to just shift the focus from evaluation in the museum, from institutional progress to how is the museum affecting the community, and what is the progress with the museum's relationship with the community. And so thinking about it on 3 levels, how are they reaching individuals outside, individual visitors? How are they reaching communities? So are they engaging communities in issues? Are they helping them deal with concerns and issues that they have? And then within the museum framework itself, the museum community, how does opening authority impact the way our relationships with our staff, with our volunteers? Is giving up authority helping to create a more open community within the museum itself? So I'm hoping to talk a little bit more about that in the question and answer, because I'm already running over. So take-home points. Especially for me, this exercise was wonderful because it really forced me to open my eyes and look around to models at other disciplines and areas. As an archaeologist, I spend a lot of time looking down at the ground. So being forced to look up was really excellent, and finding the open authority model was really exciting. And also going out looking for partners, because there really are a lot of museums who want to be doing this work. And also a focus on incremental progress. Almost all of the things in the volume, the projects in the volume, were the capstone of about 5 to 10 years of work, and started out as more contributory and evolved to collaborative and co-creative. So even if you're at one end of the spectrum, incremental progress means if you keep working at it, you will likely hit the co-creative if you have this kind of open authority framework in mind. And so finally, just thinking more about the next step, how do we evaluate these projects to really show they're valuable so that we get buy-in from the upper levels of our museums to implement them? Thank you.
All right. Do we have any questions for Elizabeth? I know somebody in the audience was tweeting about whether some of these case studies were findable online for download. Do you have?
So this is really, answer this quickly, interesting, because museums and social issues is trying to be more open, but they can't actually open their PDFs and make them open access. But if you contact me, I'm trying to get them to send PDFs so that we can send them out to interested individuals without paying. So if whoever that was contacts me, I will work with you, because I have a few other people who are also trying to get it.
Come up and do the business card swap afterwards.
Yeah.
All right, so next, Porchia Moore.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. I have to adjust this because I'm tall. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So like Elizabeth, I actually come to the museum world from a sort of strange place. I actually used to be a professor of English literature. But I have a extreme passion for museums, and so I'm really, really excited at the types of work that I'm allowed to do. So as a researcher, I'm very much interested in trying to understand the best way to engage the modern museum visitor, in particular the visitor of color. I'm also interested in how technology changes the museum and how the museum actually changes the visitor. So one initial way that I kind of begin to try and answer these questions is attempting to be very, very clear about how we define this term community. And in trying to define it, I'm trying to understand who is actively participating in museums and who is also not engaging at all, whether it's physically or digitally. So for me, this idea of open authority is exactly the type of direction we need to move in. It's exactly the model that we need to facilitate accessibility and provide unique opportunities for dialogue from within these communities who simply don't engage. So this idea of a bridge between the museum as a kind of temple forum with the mechanics and freedom of Web 2.0 tools is an important step in reaching groups that museums have been attempting for a very long time to cultivate and engage, but with very little reciprocity or retention. So actually, I'm excited about this year's theme, Remaking the Museum, because I think it's important to take a critical look at the things that we're doing and see what value that we can find in them. So I would like to offer a metaphor of sorts, and I'm extending this metaphor, which I first introduced at Museums in the Web of this year. So I'd like for us to consider that we could rebuild the museum as a kaleidoscope. So why a kaleidoscope? People want to see their lived experiences, their representations of cultural heritage, their collective memories and narratives, and as many varied colors of the spectrum of truth as possible. A kaleidoscope holds the viewer's attention because there is beauty in its diverse colors and patterns. So let us imagine the museum as a kaleidoscope. The museum itself is the cylinder. The colored bits of glass and glass beads and paper represents its diverse audience. The mirrors are its objects, and identity is the light which we produce a multifaceted vision, a kaleidoscopic vision. So I want to pause here, though, and talk more about identity. For me, identity is important, not just in terms of this metaphor of museums as kaleidoscope, but also in helping us to really understand why open authority as a model is so important in terms of engagement. Open authority leads to an opportunity to create a new identity where the authoritative voice and demeanor of the museum takes on a new character, one that is not perceived as aloof or unapproachable or distant, but an identity of collaborator, of ally, and of friend. John Falk, in his time-honored visitor identity model, argued that there are 5 classic identities which motivate visitors to come to the museum. There is the explorer, the facilitator, the experience seeker, the professional or hobbyist, and the recharger. But this model needs some updating because it doesn't take into account the digital needs for information or explain the identity of the online visitor. But more importantly, we don't have a single permanent identity. In fact, if you take a look at these pictures, these families represent the types of museum visitors that you more than likely have. In fact, we are a multitude of complex identities. Cultural norms and values are shifting rapidly, and they're changing how we should view our sense of community. We must be sure that our expert content and what we do with visitor feedback and user-generated content makes rooms for these cultural shifts. This shift comes with the understanding that our communities can no longer be simply labeled urban, Latino, Black, white, gay, or straight. Changing racial demographics and cultural shifts means that open authority must be mindful of complex multiple racial identities and new family structures. Therefore, being clear about identity is key, because it also speaks to who we say we are as museums in the 21st century. What is our identity to our diverse communities? How are we perceived by others? More importantly, how do we perceive others? To change perceptions of authority, what can we do to address communities with diverse pluralities? So how do we rebuild? I would argue that we first begin with a foundation of open authority. And I propose that the model contains two key elements. The first is that it must employ the language of cultural literacy. And second, it has to strive for radical trust. A radical trust in our communities that their user-generated content has value and worth, and also instilling trust in our communities by willingness to provide a platform of authority. So in my mind, open authority is a kind of discourse of participation. And in order for that discourse to ring true and to be accepted by diverse communities, it has to employ language which categorically disassociates itself from a framework of authoritative knowing in terms of vocabulary, terminology, and phraseology, which implies exclusivity. This means that projects, outreach, and online content has to genuinely create spaces of co-creation and not exist simply as spaces of invitation. So I'm going to clarify that just a little bit. That means that invited spaces, although good, subtly imply a sense of otherness or outsider status, a kind of us versus them dichotomy. However, co-creation, this willingness of the museum to boldly provide a platform for a minority voice, actually empowers that visitor to shift in their own minds from outsider welcome into a perceived place of invitation to one of co-creator who willingly and joyfully provides content and participates in partnership with an expert. So that now the authority identity, which was once perceived as a very real barrier to the museum, has become a great equalizer of power. And this way the museum experience feels personally navigated and not controlled. We might also consider that the museum's invited spaces might in fact be promoting difference and not inclusion. Invited spaces, not co-created ones, subtly suggest that visitors are beneficiaries of authority, and as a result, this actually influences what visitors feel they can and should contribute. And finally, open authority must convey the message that the museum does not represent a dominant culture which privileges white ways of knowing. So I wanted to share an anecdote. A couple of months ago in one of my museum management courses, we were asked to go out and survey students from local colleges and universities about their attitudes towards museums and try to assess their museum-going behavior. And so I actually went and visited 3 different classes. One class was a master's level poetry class. The other class was a group of students who were PhD students in a statistics course. And then I went and visited a freshman English course at a historically black college. And one of the things that I found was so interesting is that in the last 5 years, none of those students had actually visited a museum, even though they expressed that they felt that museums were very, very important, particularly in documenting and preserving the history of enslaved people. But one of the things that kind of was a reoccurring theme was this very real perception that one of the barriers to the museum was this sense of authority. And so if you were here on Wednesday night at the Ignite reception, I found myself kind of cracking up at Don Undine's curatorial character, because literally the kinds of feedback and comments that I got from these students was that the museum kind of had this, that they felt that the museum basically contained Don's character. So your character was, I thought, was really just spot on and was perfect. So I would like to offer, I hate to say a solution, but I think that one of the ways we could maybe address this sort of issue of how communities of color might be perceiving the museum and their authoritative power is to consider social media as a kind of solution. And so what we know is that people of color are very, very connected to the web via their via their handheld devices. And in fact, African Americans, out of all minority groups, utilizes Twitter and Instagram more than anyone else. And so there was a study conducted by Ken Vernon, and of the Asian Americans who participated in the study, 71% of those Asian Americans use Facebook at least weekly. 53% of those African Americans that participated in the study used Facebook at least, 53% used Facebook at least weekly, and 52% of Hispanic Americans use Facebook at least weekly. And I think if we could stop and consider some ways that we could cultivate new and diverse users through social media and other forms of social technology, this might begin a way to establish a radical trust within the museum. I think I'm going to stop here just in the interest of time, but my final comment would just be that I would argue that expert authority plus insights from diverse audiences equals a kaleidoscopic museum practicing open authority. Thank you.
Before you go, Portia, could you just give a little definition of radical trust? Because I'm not sure that that's a concept that everybody will be aware of. Like me.
Okay, so just based on my,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. What do you mean when you say radical trust?
By radical trust, I mean, the only way I can maybe think to define it is to just sort of literally throw your arms back, if that makes sense. So just literally kind of having this willingness and desire to really step outside of yourself and introduce literally go outside of your museum to establish a relationship. So to really work really hard to just kind of rebuild a sense of trust. Because when I interviewed those HBCU students, there was this real sense that the museum was not an establishment that they could trust. They didn't feel that the museum could really tell their stories authentically and tell them in a way that would ring true.
Hey.
Hey.
Okay, thanks everybody. So my name is Jeff Inscho, and I guess my part of this is to kind of show how open authority can or can't impact museum practice. Earlier this year, my museum, the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, we dove kind of head first in with our first foray into an open authority project. It was a co-creative project, which we affectionately called OSNAP. And notice I said project and not exhibition. We'll get back to that. So I think before we get into the details of this particular project, it's important to begin with a little bit of institutional context. The image you're looking at now is from 1896. And in it, you can see artworks being delivered to our museum via horse-drawn wagons. I think it says a lot about our institution. On one hand, it's just that, right? It's an institution. And not only that, it's one with more than a century of institutional tradition, processes, workflows, operations that have kind of been ingrained into the fabric of the place. I don't think CMOA is alone in this respect, and I'm really not speculating on whether or not this is a good or bad thing. I'm just kind of pointing it out and annotating it as an accepted truth. But on the other hand, my museum has aspirations of achieving relevance in the lives of non-traditional museum goers, right? Read millennials, or that highly coveted holy grail of demography. So part of this means operating in sync with and not in competition against the fast-moving world around us, this idea that Coven presents of the kinetic museum. And so reimagining our programming so it resonates with people on their terms and their turf. I mean, that's kind of where open authority comes in for us. So in the fall of 2012, almost a year ago, we were presented with an interesting challenge by our director. A slot was made open in our forum gallery for an open-ended experiment. And the goals and specifications set forth to us for this project were this. One, create an experience where visitors can engage with real artworks in a personally meaningful way. We had to use collection objects. This was at the insistence of our director. Number two, make new connections to this target demographic of 20 to 40-year-olds, particularly by connecting real-world and online experiences. Number three, open up the museum to a true dialogue with the public and have that public actively impact the content and the display of that content in the gallery. And finally, number four, be clear that this was not an exhibition in the traditional sense, but that it was an experimental project. And so with those directives in hand, a cross-departmental, cross-hierarchical team of colleagues were off to the races. So the working group tasked with making this thing happen was diverse and broad. It included technologists like myself, but also museum educators, editors, art handlers, curatorial assistants, representatives from our registrar's office. Like, it was a broad kind of consensus of a group. We met regularly over the course of maybe 6 months or so to kind of wrestle around with our ideas and explore adjacent possibilities. This is another concept Coven brings up a lot, and pursue what we thought were invigorating ideas and ultimately refine those ideas down to kind of a cohesive and full-featured project. So on the other side of all this ideation, we emerged with this concept that we were all really, really stoked about. And so the premise was this. We would utilize 13 recent acquisitions from our photography department as kind of the launch pad for the project. And decisions about which works were made democratically by the group. And we would display these objects in the gallery. We would then invite visitors to respond to these artworks in a visual or photographic capacity via their smartphones or via their desktop computers. And we would use these responses and feedback to inform the presentation of this whole thing in the gallery. We'd make every attempt to bridge the digital and physical components of the project, from event programming to submission experience. It was really important for us that this project have real-world impact. And finally, we would be institutionally okay if it flopped. We were aware it was a risk, and we were somewhat cool with that. So all of this sounds like super lofty and conceptual and full of museum speak, and we realized that in order for this project to succeed, we needed to accurately and effectively communicate what we were trying to do with our audience. Strike that, our co-creators, our partners in this, because that's what they really were. They weren't an audience. They were going to help us make this thing. So we settled on a short, kind of memorable, snappy name, OSNAP. We employed bold colors and fonts in the graphic design. We made it as easy as possible for people to participate. And we threw a crazy launch party, and that's what you're looking at here. It's from a light painting booth at the party. So we kind of tied all this together. People could go in there and paint with light in the dark, and then have their photos, and it was really cool. And like most tech startups, we created a video trailer for this as a way of really accurately and easily conveying what this thing was all about. It's short, it's 2 minutes, and it's pretty funny. So I'm gonna play it right now if you guys don't mind. Do it.
I can't wait. I can't wait. I can't wait, my love, for the morning. We're on our way. On our way. On our way with style in the morning. La da 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 da. Your eyes are on me. La da 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 da. Your eyes are on me. 'Cause I can't wait. I can't wait. I can't wait, my love, for the morning. La da 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 da. La da da da. La da 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 da. La da da da. We're on our way. On our way. On our way with style in the morning. La da 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 da. Your eyes are on me. La da 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 da. Your eyes are on me. Keep your eyes on me.
That's that, and we really found that to be super effective of communicating what it is we were trying to do. So I think I would be somewhat remiss if at one of the museum sector's like largest technology conferences that I didn't touch on the technology that was kind of underlying all of this that made it such an interactive experience. We built a responsive website that served as both the project archive and also the submission vehicle. So this was mainly an accessibility decision for us, but it also had budget implications because we had the skill set in-house to do that. And so once we realized that most of the major mobile operating systems actually accessed the camera rolls, I mean, it was a kind of a no-brainer for us to do that, so no app needed. The rest of the thing was kind of like a digital Rube Goldberg experiment. We daisy-chained a ton of third-party services together to facilitate the submission queue, approval process, website upload, and participant notifications. So things like Wufoo fed into Dropbox, fed into IFTTT, fed into WordPress, fed into MailChimp. And a lot of variables were at play, and I'm honestly kind of surprised it worked, but it did. Yeah, it was crazy. And so the result was this kind of participatory, open authority infused project that blurred the digital and the physical. So I'll just kind of walk you through some installation shots real quick. This is the entrance to the gallery, something bold fonts, bright colors, very different from what we have done in the past institutionally. This was the gallery itself. We staffed it full-time with a museum educator who would during the day be printing out all of the photo submissions and hanging them, interacting with people as they came into the gallery, answering questions. It was also cool to have somebody in there to kind of monitor things and see how people were experiencing the exhibition, watching how much time they spent at artworks, and we really found that the time spent at artworks increased because people were looking at the photos, looking back at the artwork, and trying to make the connection between the submitted photo and the work that was on the wall. Just to kind of show you how it was hung with people in the photo for some scale. This is about 3/4 of the way through the run of the show, and it got a lot more full after this. A detail of one work with its surrounding images. You can see on the title card underneath the artwork. We also attached custom Post-it notes that if someone was just learning about this project, they could actually pull the Post-it note off. It had an image of the artwork, and it had a short URL where they could just go and submit if they wanted to. So that we found that to be pretty effective. We also had a comment area outside the gallery where people could draw responses if they wanted to, or write responses. And this was pretty, it was well used. And this gallery is right in the entrance to our museum, so there's a lot of foot traffic, and it kind of did a good job of actually getting people into the gallery. This is one of the works we hung. It's Richard Misrach, rollerblades on the Bonneville Salt Flats, and you can see it's like a singular person, very kind of wide expanse of a landscape behind him. And I'll just roll through quickly some of the submissions. You know, vacation photos, obviously a staged response to the photo. Another kind of more candid submission. And this was cool. This guy wasn't the only one to do this, but there were people that would actually submit photos from inside our museum. This is an artwork in our collection where he responded to that Misrach photo, and you can definitely see it. So it got people thinking about our collection in different ways, which was really cool. Everyone was really excited about that. So I guess you're probably interested in kind of the results and how we determined whether or not this thing was a success. During the 2.5 months of the project, we received a total of 1,264 submissions. All of them, except for one, made it onto the walls of the gallery and onto the website. Some of them are really great, and you can view them all on the microsite we built, osnap.cmoa.org. 41% of all of our participants fell into that target age demographic we were looking for, the 20 to 40-year-olds. That was by far the largest demo group, so I think we were successful in reaching that ever-elusive millennial group. The lion's share of submissions came from the Western Pennsylvania and tri-state area, but we did receive a good number of submissions from Europe, South America, and Asia, so it did have this global component as well. We gave all participants via email a free pass to the museum to come view their work, and 10% of those passes came back to us. That may seem kind of low, but when you think about it in relation to the average return rate of 3% that we get for things like that, we were pretty happy with that percentage. And it also, it doesn't account for like members coming for free or like people coming without their passes. So, I'm just going to kind of leave you guys with this image. It's one of the many handwritten notes that we received from visitors during the project, and so validation like this was super important for both the working group, but also museum leadership to see this kind of feedback. And it really did go a long way in affirming to us that we really made something that meant something, not only to us, but to a community of participants who actively partnered with us to make the thing. And we couldn't have done it without the community. So thanks. All the slides and the script are at that link. If you're interested, if you have questions, we can chat here. You can shoot me a note. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.